in the last two lectures, what we have discussed is to try to engage in looking at the historical roots of our ecological crisis, which is put forward by the historian Lynn White, and where we have discussed at length about how the Judeo-Christian religion, with the use of science and technology, in some sense push forward the idea of how nature in some sense has been subdued or dominated at a very to a large extent, and thereby causing a lot of binaries at the same time, trying to spoil the relationship between human and nature. And then also we have discussed the Asian religions, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism, wherein the very notions of conservation ethics were very much strictly followed by most of those Asian religions. Now, to conclude this module, in this lecture, what we are going to look at is primarily look into Christian religion, and also tries to make a critical review of what Lynn White has posited, and at the same time try to engage looking at the code or message which is being shared by none other than the Pope John Paul Jr. II. So that way we will be able to make or try to engage in a much more holistic when we are dealing with the module, trying to see how religion is in some sense to be seen vis-a-vis the conservations of nature, so on and so forth. Now, as we have already pointed out and tried to look in some of the works which has been put forward by Lynn White way back in 1966 in his piece where he published in the journal Science, which is entitled as The Historical Root of Our Ecological Crisis. Now, what Lynn White in some sense tries to argue is that our Western Christian worldview in some way or the other tends to support and encourage the exploitations of nature. And Lynn White blames the Christian attitudes toward nature for our current ecological crisis, and he says that especially in its Western form, Christianity is the most anthropocentric religion the world have ever seen. Whereas in the pagan, that is the pre-Christian religions, spirits were almost seen to be present everywhere in nature, which is more importantly known as pantheism. So Christianity in some sense has evolved and flourished for quite some time, and over a period of time the very notions of how the biocentrism or the very intricate relationship or interconnections between man and natures have changed and evolved over a period of time. Now, therefore, Christianity does not only create or establish a binary or a dualism of man and nature, but also at the same time insisted that it is God's will that man sort of exploit nature for his proper ends. So Christianity therefore is seen to be, as argued by Lynn White, one of the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever witnessed. So one of the important or the particular roots of the problem are usually, generally traced back to certain features of the creation narratives in the Bible, that is in the book of Genesis, and also especially about the transcendence of people over nature. So what is being a witness in the book of Genesis is that God instructed humanity to be fruitful and multiply, and also fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So the very notion or the strength of this imperative, that is subdue the earth, is indicated by the meaning of the Hebrew word rather, which is literally, that is to trampled. So in some sense, humanity was the pinnacle of creations, that is which is clearly distinguished from nature by being made in God's own image. So this duality is seen in contrast with animism and most of the Eastern religions, where deity and nature are much more at one with each other. That is, there is an intrinsic relationship of human and nature, and thereby there is no dualism as such. However, Western Christianity being the most anthropocentric religions, as argued by Lynn White, there is a dualism which is being created. So therefore, not only was humanity separated from the rest of the creation, but the purpose of nature was solely to provide for or satisfy human needs, rather than having a value of its own. And therefore, God in some sense gave an overriding power to people, so that they are in some sense bestowed with the rights to sort of control over the creatures of the earth. So thus the the foundations was laid, that is the very basis for society's arrogant attitude towards nature, providing the divine mandate for resource exploitations, and result in which eventually resulted in ecological damage. So White actually laid the blame not so much on the creation account itself, which perhaps as on the outworking, but what Lynn White particularly tends to posit was that science and technology, which is combined for the purpose of harnessing nature in pursuit of the the perceived human benefit. So this was done pretty much effectively, and which eventually harmed nature or the art in particular. So one of his conclusions was that modern Western science, that is science and technology, was cast in a matrix of Christian theology, which sort of cater to damning and an indictment of the Christian communities human nature relationship in particularly North America. So therefore, what is interesting is that Lynn White's piece in some sense has arrived at a very important juncture, that is few years after Rachel's Curson's very seminal work, which in some sense tends to provoke the very nature of how environmental concerns and then issues which were encountered more importantly by humans all over the world. So Carson's work, that is the Spring in some sense, tries to look into the way in which how man's attitude towards nature and have to some extent caused a gigantic problem to nature at the same time in return to human being. So the period that is 60s and 70s, in some sense, the very nature of thinking which was predominant in North America drove their inspirations from mostly the non-Western countries or traditions such as the ancient and the Native American religion, where they are supposedly tends to share a much more intrinsic and holistic relationship with natures. So Christians, especially those who are more theologically liberal, have in some sense evolved and tends to discard the ideas which were put forward by many of those people in the past, and have argued that their faith has actually lost in the Western culture, and what Asian spirituality and had retained in the East, namely the notions of the unity of all things and the intrinsic value of all life. So the dualistic and anthropocentric theology of Western Christianity, that is in the late 1960s and 70s, sort of face powerful challenges from many of the Native American spiritualists as well, because the Native Americans were in some sense trying to push forward the very notions of worldview, and thereby subsequently become an environmentalist. So ecology, the very term ecology, become synonymous with the limitations that the First Nation societies, that is mostly the American or the Native Americans, voluntarily impose upon themselves for the sake of nature. So in opposition to the Western Christianity, which sort of tries to give utmost importance to the idea of, that is, the supremacy of humanity, which we have perhaps tends to draw from the story of creation, which is pretty much spelled out in the book of Genesis. So the pantheism of Asia and the animism of North America met in direct confrontations to the biblical injunction, that is to dominate and subdue the earth, that is dominate and subdue the earth, which of course is a power or an authority which is being bestowed upon by God. So the very assumption that link Christian principles to anti-environmentalism was pretty much illustrated by the way in which Christians responded to the ideological conflict over the art and humanity's place on it. So therefore, there is an urging need to revisit and revise the very notions of dominions, and also the biblical mandate, that is to subdue the earth, became some of the urging needs. More importantly, which is posited by scholars who have engaged in trying to interrogate the very notions of Christian religious principles vis-a-vis the relationship with nature. So the very hostility that is towards Christian ideas of environment led to a desperate attempts of say the church to remake itself, to reinvent or renew its commitment to of being the custodians of the earth, or in short, the earth keeping. So that very notions of how men should actually manage or look after the earth in some sense is have become a very urgent need which has been witnessed. So one of the drastic changes which is evident from Lynn White's argument or his seminal work was in fact a burgeoning of the Christian scholarship, which sort of tries to revitalize the theological debates over the accurate biblical portrayal of the sense of stewardship. That is, the notions of the greening of religion even produce a new genres of theology, such as for example, the theology of nature, theology of ecology or eco-theology, and the theology of creations. Therefore, White's argument thesis in some sense tends to bring a structural changes or a shift in the perspectives of many of these, particularly the Christian scholarship. So in the midst of this raging cultural conflict over the environment, essentially a battle over the issues of moral authority, over the rights of nature, most Christians tries to remake their ideological framework, that is, in order to overturn the anthropocentric and dualistic assumptions inherent in their relationship with nature. So therefore, Christian scholars reinforce White's full argument, namely that since the period that is 1850, Christians have by and large were in some sense unconcerned with the environment and have utilized misinformed theology developed in the medieval times to exploit and degrade God's own creation. So by separating themselves from the historic past of the church, most Christian environmental authors or scholars and organizations magnified the assumptions of other authors. Thus, the predominant characterizations of Christianity as so heavenly minded as to be no earthly good became entrenched within and reinforced by the church organizations. So even though the integrations was one of the central themes of the new Christian environmental conscience. Now, perhaps Lynn White, thesis has provided an unmistakable link between the rise of science, that is through the Judeo-Christian traditions in the Middle Ages, even though the moral course was largely borne by Christianity and not science. So he made the connections, the firm connections between reason and faith that had been lost to the church in the early 20th century. So White argued that since the roots of our troubles are so largely rooted in religion, the remedy also must be essentially religion, whether we call it that or not. So therefore, the very notions or outlook with regards to religion has in some sense to be restructured and then reframed in order to wipe out the problems which we have encountered. So since the period, the post Lynn White's thesis, that is since 1967, academia has been increasingly open to Christians' ideas on the environment. So Roderick Nash, who was particularly important in trying to push forward the idea of American wilderness, also decried the pervasive otherworldliness of Christianity. So while much work went into exploring the nature of biblical relationship to nature, little explorations of Christian thought and action, particularly on the ecological issues, has been attempted in and what can only be termed as the missing century of creation history, that is the period between 1850 to 1950. So one cannot ignore the ways in which religion, especially Christianity, justified subduing of the earth. So since the 18th century, Christians have not actively engaged in the debate over the status of nature, that is creation, the care of animals, husbandry, and debate over human agency in the environment, that is particular to conservations and preservations. Now, to sum up the discussions so far, we can sort of like looked at the message which is given by Pope John Paul II, which is entitled as the ecological crisis, which of course is a common responsibility on the celebrations of World Peace Day way back in 1990. So God's first revelation to humanity, that is in the book of Genesis chapter 1 to 3, there is a recurring refrain that is, and God saw that it was good. So after creating heavens, the sea, the earth, and all it contains, God created man and woman. So God in some sense again entrusted the whole of creations to the man and woman, and only then, as we read, could he rest from all his work. So in some sense, what we are trying to do here is try to relook at the very biblical content which perhaps might have been misinterpreted or tends to be seen in translated or in a very different way. So made in the image of his and likeness of God, Adam and Eve were to have exercised their dominion over the earth, which is in Genesis 1:28, with wisdom and love. So instead, they happens to disregard the commandment which is given by God, and then they destroyed the existing harmony by deliberately going against the Creator's plan, that is by choosing to sin. So this resulted not only in man's alienations from himself in death and fratricide, but also in the earth's rebellion against him. So what the very notions of how Adams and Eve by not trying to follow the commandment of God, and therefore because of their sin that humankind has to pay the price, and therefore the very notions of harmony has been in the Garden of Eden has been spoiled as a consequence of them not listening to the commandment of God. So what Pope John Paul tries to bring in here is that the very biblical context that is in the New Testament, that is where because of the coming of Jesus Christ, that there is a new lease of life, that is Christians again believe in the very notions of the death and resurrections of Christ, accomplish the work of trying to reconcile humanity to the Father. That is what has been done wrong in the past, that is in the Genesis, that is in the very first days of creations, where Adam and Eve tries to alienate and then tries to distance themselves from God. So who, because of the coming of Christ, that was pleased through Christ to reconcile him to himself all things, that is irrespective of what they have done, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. So in some sense you could sort of create that Christ has actually becomes a sacrificial lamb because of him giving his life, even by crucifying him to the cross. In some sense he has created a kind of a harmony or a reconciliations between the human and that of the Father who has created the earth. So therefore the very notions of these creations was thus made new, which is seen in the book of Revelations 21:5. So once from then on, we as a human were subjected to the bondage of sin and have lead a life of decay, and through the coming or through the crucifixions of Christ, it has now received a new life, while we wait for new heavens and also a new earth in which righteousness dwells. So through the blood of Christ, we in some sense has cleansed our sins and are now on a righteous path. So thus the Father has made known to us in all his wisdom and insight the mystery which he set forth in Christ as a plan for the fulfillment of time, to unite all things in him, all things in heaven and things on earth, which is seen in the book of Ephesians 1:9 to 10. So these biblical considerations help us to understand better the relationship between human activity and the notions of the whole idea of creation. So when man turns his back on the Creator's plan, that is the Master's plan, he provokes disharmony or a disorder which has inevitable repercussions on the rest of the created order. So one has to rethink and maintain a renewed relationship, and what Pope John Paul was trying to appealed or to the humankind was respect for life. That is particularly the Christian outlook or the Christian way of life has to, in some sense, or the worldview has to change with respect to other forms of life or nature in particular. So the most profound and serious indications of the moral implications underlying the ecological problem is that of the respect of life, which is evident in many patterns of the environmental pollution. So on another level, delicate ecological balances are upset by the uncontrolled destructions of animal and plant life, or by a reckless exploitations of natural resources. So then the very notions of dominant and subduing or subdue is in some sense has to be replaced. So respect for life and above all for the dignity of the human person is the ultimate guiding norm for any sound economic, industrial or scientific progress. So one can perhaps tries to go back and looked into the way in which how Murray Bookchin talk about in social ecology, that the way we tends to relate ourselves to nature also has and repercussions or the implications within the human relations in terms of forming a hierarchy, so and so forth. So therefore, our attitudes or our perceptions about the way we deal with nature is very much important. So Pope John Paul also, appeal for a peaceful society, that no peaceful society can afford to neglect either respect for life or the fact that there is an integrity to creation, which talk about the intrinsic value of all forms of life. And also there is an urgent need for solidarity. The ecological crisis reveals the urgent moral need for a new solidarity, especially in relations between the developing nations and those that are highly industrialized. So that binary between the developed, the underdeveloped, and developing has to be, the barriers has to be broken, and then a new form of solidarity has to be created. So when the ecological crisis is set within the broader context of the search for peace within society, that is, we can which in some sense talks about the very notions of self-realization as posited by the Norwegian philosopher Arne Nest, that and then possibly we can understand better the importance of giving attentions to what the earth and its atmosphere are telling us. So namely, that is an order in the universe which must be respected, and that human person endowed with the capability of choosing freely has a grave responsibility to preserve this order for the well-being of future generations. So therefore, the ecological crisis which we have witnessed is nothing but a moral issue. So therefore, the moral conscience or principles which is very much embedded in every humankind has to change, so that our outlook and attitude towards nature will eventually change. So for further detailed understanding of the speech or message which is given by Pope John Paul, you can refer this piece which is here in the slide. So now we have in some sense tries to cover like almost the dominant religions which have tries to posits or make sense of their ideas of conservations, outlook, principles, their very nature, the worldview towards how we as a human has to in some sense reconcile. At the same time, our moral attitudes has to change, so that the ecological crisis can in some sense be solved or stop. Thank you.